By the West River, there's a narrow alley called Bottle Hidden Alley. Not many people know of it, for it has long been forgotten. But perhaps that's for the best, for no one wishes to go there anymore. Why, you ask? Because it's a place where restless spirits dwell. Our story begins on a stormy night, years ago, with a man named Henry. Henry was a traveling salesman, the kind who carried all his goods in a big wooden box strapped to his back. He was the type who never stopped moving, no matter the weather. But on this particular night, even Henry was ready to call it quits. Rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind, it howled like a pack of wolves. Henry was soaked to the bone, stumbling along a muddy path in the dark. He wasn't even sure where he was anymore. "Where's the damn town?" he muttered to himself, squinting through the rain. He'd been told the town was nearby, but now it felt like he was walking in circles. Just when he thought he might have to sleep under a tree, he spotted it, a faint light flickering in the distance. Finally, he sighed, relief washing over him. As he got closer, he realized the light was coming from a window, the window of an old, crumbling house. The kind of house that makes your stomach turn for no reason. But Henry was desperate. He knocked on the door, hard enough to be heard over the storm. And then, the door opened. Standing there was a woman, pale, with long black hair that clung to her face like wet vines. Her eyes, they were dark, too dark, like they didn't belong to her. "Come in," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain. Henry hesitated. Something about her wasn't right, but the rain was cold and the house was dry. So he stepped inside. Now, here's where things start getting strange. The house was freezing, colder than it should have been for a place with walls and a roof, and there was no fire, no hearth, no candles, just that one weak lamp in the corner. The woman handed him a cup of water. "Drink," she said, her voice flat, almost mechanical. Henry took the cup and raised it to his lips, but as soon as the water touched his tongue, he stopped. It was cold, not room temperature cold, ice cold, like it had just been pulled from a frozen stream. "Thank you," he said quickly, setting the cup down. He couldn't bring himself to drink more. The woman didn't say anything. She just stared at him for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the next room. That's when Henry noticed something. The house. It was too quiet. No creaking floorboards, no ticking clock. Not even the sound of rain on the roof. Just silence. He tried to shrug it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. But then he heard it. A sound coming from the back of the house. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded like a needle pulling through cloth. Curiosity got the better of him. He crept toward the noise, peeking around the corner. And there she was, the woman sitting at a table with a needle and thread. She was sewing. But what she was sewing wasn't fabric. It was skin. Henry gasped, and in that instant her head snapped up. She looked directly at him. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. Henry didn't wait to find out what she meant. He bolted back to the front door, yanking it open and running out into the storm. But as soon as he stepped outside, he realized something was wrong. The alley, it wasn't the same. The houses around him were crumbling ruins, covered in moss and vines, like they'd been abandoned for years. And the light in the window? Gone. Panic set in as Henry stumbled down the alley, trying to find his way out. But no matter which way he turned, He kept ending up back in front of the same house, the same door, and standing in the doorway was her. "You can't leave," she said, stepping closer. Henry's heart was pounding now, but he forced himself to speak. "What do you want from me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and placed something in his hand. A small wooden hairpin, carved with delicate patterns. "Take this," she said. "Go to the town and find the merchant who owns it. Tell him I'm still waiting." And just like that, she was gone. When Henry looked around, the storm had stopped. The alley was empty. The next morning, he did as she asked. He found the merchant, an old man with tired eyes. When Henry showed him the hairpin, the man's face turned pale. "Where did you get this?" the merchant demanded. Henry told him everything. The alley, the house, the woman. The merchant shook his head. "That woman, she was my wife's maid. She disappeared 3 years ago. We searched everywhere but never found her. What you saw, it couldn't have been her." But Henry knew what he saw. The merchant insisted on going back to Bottle Alley with Henry. When they reached the house, they found it just as Henry had described. And in the back room, buried under the floorboards, they found her. Or what was left of her. The merchant arranged for a proper burial, and they laid her to rest. But even now people say, if you walk down Bottle Alley at night, you might see a light in that old house. And if you're brave enough to knock, you'll find her sitting at her table, sewing, and maybe, just maybe, she'll have a message for you too. Imagine it's the early 1800s, and the town of Huntsville, Alabama, is nothing like the bustling city it is today. It's a quiet, peaceful place, filled with small, tight-knit communities. Life moves at a slower pace, and the landscape is dotted with oak trees and wide open spaces. But in 1822, something significant happened that would alter this town forever. In the heart of Huntsville, a cemetery known as Maple Hill Cemetery was founded. Now, that name might not sound too ominous, but trust me, this isn't just any cemetery. It's one of the oldest, most historic burial grounds in Alabama, with its roots stretching back to the earliest days of the state. However, over time, something far more unsettling began to emerge, a legend that still lingers to this day. Let's take a step back in time and explore the eerie, chilling history of Maple Hill Cemetery, a place where whispers of ghostly children still echo in the wind. Now, back in the early days of the cemetery, the locals never thought much of the land. It was quiet, peaceful, a resting place for the dearly departed. But as years went on, something changed. The cemetery began to grow. More and more people were buried there. And eventually, right in the middle of this sacred ground, a playground was built. Yes, right there, among the tombstones and weathered gravestones, stood a playground. But it wasn't like any playground you'd expect to see in a neighborhood today. No, this one was much older, much more worn. The swings creaked in the wind, the slides were chipped and rusted, and the merry-go-round barely turned. But the strangest thing about it, the strange occurrences that started happening at night. You see, the locals began to report odd things happening in the dead of night. The first signs were small. Whispers in the air, shadows moving across the playground when no one was around. And then, the swings started to move. No wind, no reason at all. Just slowly, gently swaying back and forth, as though some invisible hand were pushing them. And it didn't stop there. People began to see glowing orbs, balls of light drifting across the cemetery, floating, moving as though they had a mind of their own. And if that wasn't enough to raise the hairs on the back of your neck, there were the voices, laughter, children's laughter, coming from nowhere, echoing through the dark, empty playground. But there was no one there, no children playing, just the faint, unnerving sound of laughter in the air. And the worst part? Those who heard it couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. A presence that never seemed to leave the cemetery. A cold chill that settled over the place once the sun set. But the strangest chapter of this tale begins in the 1960s. Several children went missing, and their disappearances were never fully explained. And it wasn't long before the rumors started to spread. Whispers about the old cemetery playground. You see, it was said that these children didn't just vanish without a trace. No, they were taken by something dark, something sinister that lurked in the shadows of Maple Hill. And after they disappeared, something far more horrifying was found. The bodies of these missing children were discovered, but not in the way anyone expected. They had died in the most unnatural of ways, their bodies twisted and broken as though something or someone had been toying with them. And the worst part? The deaths seemed to be centered around that very playground. Now I know what you might be thinking. These are just rumors, right? Just a local myth passed down over generations. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. For years, the residents of Huntsville were haunted by the tragic deaths of these children. Their restless spirits seemed to cling to the playground, unable to find peace. So, in an attempt to make the place less unsettling, a construction project was set in motion to tear down the playground. The idea was to build more burial plots for the growing cemetery. And maybe, just maybe, the ghosts of these children would be laid to rest. But something strange happened when they started to dismantle the playground. Complaints started pouring in. People began to say that even though the swings were removed, even though the slides and the merry-go-round were taken down, the hauntings didn't stop. If anything, they only grew stronger. You see, it wasn't the playground that was the source of the hauntings. It was the spirits of the children themselves. And despite the efforts to tear it all down, the ghosts continued to haunt the cemetery, lingering in the shadows, waiting for someone to acknowledge their tragic end. Today, the legend of the haunted cemetery playground continues to haunt the people of Huntsville. Maple Hill Cemetery may have a new modern playground for children to enjoy, but the old tragic playground remains embedded in the history of the town. The ghosts of the kidnapped children, their souls forever tied to the place where they met their end, continue to haunt the cemetery. And while some might say it's just a story, the eerie feeling still lingers, especially at night. The swings that no longer move, the playground that no longer exists, but the laughter of children, it still echoes. The glowing orbs, the whispering voices, and the chilling presence, they never truly left. And so, the question remains, are the children's spirits finally at rest? Or do they still wander the cemetery, their sorrowful cries calling out to the living? No one can say for sure. But if you ever find yourself near Maple Hill Cemetery late at night, and you hear the sound of children's laughter, don't turn around. Don't look for the source. Just walk away and never look back. You ever get that feeling? Like something's just wrong? That's exactly how my morning started. My neighbor called me up, voice shaking. He said his wife was out of town, visiting their daughter. She even called him to say she'd be home late tonight. But get this, right after they hung up, she showed up at the top of the stairs. He swore she was there, standing on the landing, hiding most of her body behind the wall, just peeking out, smiling at him, but not in a way that felt right. Something was off. He thought maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, so he called me over to see if I'd see her too. I didn't want to go, but curiosity got the best of me. I got to his place, and sure enough, there she was. His wife, or whatever it was, on the second floor, crouched at the top of the stairs. She didn't say anything, just leaned out enough to show part of her face. That same smile. I called up to her. "Ma'am, you okay?" She didn't answer at first, just stared at me. Then she said 3 words. "Play with me." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a joke. It didn't even sound human. That's when I decided I was done. I turned to leave, but my neighbor ran to the kitchen to call his wife. He was yelling into the phone, trying to prove she was still out of town. That's when I saw him. My neighbor, only this time, he was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, peeking out with just half his face showing, smiling. And he said the same thing. "Play with me." At that moment, I heard his voice coming from inside the kitchen too, panicked, shouting something like, "This isn't real! This can't be real!" I didn't stick around. I bolted out of the house and got in my car. Halfway home, I thought maybe they were messing with me, trying to freak me out for fun. I almost called the cops. But what was I going to say? That my elderly neighbor wants to play hide and seek with me? When I got home, I tried to shake it off. I sat down with some breakfast and turned on the TV. The news was on. But something wasn't right. The anchor wasn't sitting at the desk. She was crouched off screen, only half her face showing, with that same twisted smile. I thought it was a glitch, so I got up to adjust the TV. That's when I saw it. Behind the TV, another face. My face. And it whispered, "Play with me." Sarah and Emma had been inseparable since childhood. They shared everything, secrets, dreams, and even fears. There was nothing that could break their bond. Sarah, always outgoing and charming, seemed to attract attention effortlessly, while Emma, the more reserved of the two, preferred a quieter, simpler life. Despite their differences, their friendship remained unshakable. One day, Sarah stumbled upon an ad online, her eyes lighting up. "Emma, you've got to see this. It's a face mask that claims to do wonders for your skin and even tests trust between friends." Emma glanced up from her book, looking skeptical. "A trust test? That sounds weird." "Oh, come on. Don't be so cautious. Don't you want to try it? If it works, our skin will look amazing and our bond will grow stronger," Sarah said with a grin, excitement filling her voice. Emma sighed, knowing she couldn't change Sarah's mind. "All right, fine. Let's try it." A few days later, Sarah received the mysterious face mask. The packaging was elegant, promising an extraordinary effect. That evening, they sat in Sarah's bathroom, carefully applying the translucent gel to their faces. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "If this really works, we'll be glowing." However, as soon as the mask touched Emma's skin, she felt an unsettling coldness, like something was moving beneath the surface of her skin. She wanted to take it off, but Sarah insisted. "Wait a little longer, Emma. It's supposed to work best after 10 minutes. Emma hesitated, trying to ignore the creeping sensation, and nodded reluctantly. 10 minutes later, they removed the mask. Their skin was noticeably smoother, brighter, and more radiant. Sarah beamed, clearly proud of the results. "See? I told you it worked." But Emma wasn't as thrilled. She stared at her reflection in the mirror and felt an eerie unease. Something didn't seem right. She looked at her hands, cold, almost lifeless, and it felt as if something sinister was invading her body, slowly taking control. She gritted her teeth, trying to push the feeling aside. A few days later, while shopping at the mall, they encountered a young store clerk. The clerk smiled at them and said, "You two look so alike. You must be sisters. What skincare product are you using?" Sarah proudly replied, "Oh, it's just this amazing face mask. The results are incredible." The clerk nodded, grinning. "You both have perfect skin. It's really amazing." Sarah smiled triumphantly at Emma, but Emma felt a growing sense of dread. She had an uncanny feeling that something was changing inside her, as if her body was slowly being altered by an unseen force. That night, when they returned home, Emma stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She felt a chilling sensation, as if she no longer recognized the face staring back at her. Sarah noticed her expression and asked in concern, "What's wrong, Emma?" Emma forced a smile. "Nothing. I'm just tired." She quickly changed the subject. "Sarah, look at this photo. Don't we look more alike now?" Sarah looked at the photo on her phone. They were standing together, smiling brightly. But as she looked closer, something wasn't right. There was a strange face in the reflection. It wasn't hers. It wasn't Emma's either. The face was unfamiliar, distant, and unsettling. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She turned to Emma, her voice trembling. "Emma, do you think we've changed?" Emma's face turned pale, her voice shaky. "Sarah, I think we're not ourselves anymore. You're starting to look more like me, and I..." She raised her hand and pointed at her face. "I don't feel like me anymore. This face, it doesn't belong to me." Sarah's heart raced. She rushed to the mirror, gazing at her reflection. She saw herself, but her eyes, they weren't hers. The familiar warmth was gone, replaced by emptiness, by something that wasn't her own. In the following days, Sarah noticed that the distance between her and Emma grew. Emma became quieter, withdrawn, and increasingly reclusive. Sarah began to feel a sense of unease growing inside her as well. Their once solid bond was fraying, and the reflection in the mirror seemed more and more foreign to both of them. One day, Sarah insisted they visit a doctor, but when they walked into the clinic, the doctor froze when he saw them. His eyes widened with shock. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Sarah blinked, confused. "What do you mean? What's wrong?" The doctor shook his head slowly, his voice filled with a mix of concern and confusion. "Your faces, they're not the same. You two, you've switched faces. You're no longer the same people." Sarah's mind went blank. She couldn't comprehend what he was saying. She looked at herself and Emma in the mirror. Their faces were still their own, but the way they looked at each other, the way their eyes held confusion, something was terribly wrong. In the months that followed, Sarah never saw Emma again. She began to realize that every time she looked into a mirror, she felt a growing sense of unfamiliarity. It was as though her reflection was no longer her own. Finally, she understood. The face mask wasn't a beauty product. It was an ancient curse. It had swapped their identities, trapping their souls in each other's bodies, stealing their true selves away. Sarah's face now wore Emma's features, while Emma was lost to the void, consumed by the curse. Sarah's life became a distorted nightmare, She could never escape the feeling that she was no longer herself. The mirror, once a simple reflection of who she was, had become her prison. She knew that she would never be able to return to who she was. The curse of the face mask had bound their souls forever, and there was no escape. The night had fallen, and the shadows of the tunnel swallowed everything. Mike and Laura were driving slowly into the abandoned tunnel. It was deep into the night, and the air felt uncomfortably cold. There was an eerie silence around them, as though the tunnel itself was devouring the world outside. Laura shivered, her eyes nervously darting out the window. "This tunnel feels wrong," she murmured, her gaze fixed ahead. "Don't worry, it's just an old tunnel," Mike replied casually. But there was a hint of unease creeping into his voice. The tunnel's walls were cracked and crumbling, the sound of their tires echoing in the emptiness. Mike pressed the gas pedal, trying to speed through it, but the darkness inside the tunnel seemed to consume them. The headlights only illuminated a small stretch of road ahead. Suddenly, a strange sound came from the top of the car. It was like something heavy was scraping along the roof, the sound dragging through the air, making the atmosphere even more suffocating. Laura grabbed Mike's arm, her face pale with fear. "Did you hear that? What was that noise?" Her voice was shaky. Mike's face tightened. He slowed down, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "It's probably just the wind moving something," he said, trying to calm her down, but his own heart was racing. Just then, something moved in the darkness outside the car. Laura's eyes widened, and she almost screamed. "Mike, look!" she nearly shouted. Mike quickly turned his head, and there, at the end of the tunnel, stood a figure. The man was dressed in a filthy, tattered bunny costume, with giant ears almost touching the car's roof. His eyes behind the rabbit mask were fixed on them, cold and emotionless. What terrified them most was the large axe he was holding, dragging along the ground with a disturbing metallic sound. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to hit the brakes but couldn't. "Who the hell is that?" His voice was hoarse. Laura was nearly hysterical now. "Drive! Now!" Mike didn't hesitate. He slammed the gas pedal, pushing the car forward. But just as they were speeding up, the bunny man suddenly stepped into their path, standing right in front of the car. Mike could see the car getting closer, but his legs felt like they were glued to the floor. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. "Go!" Laura screamed, pulling at the door handle, but it was locked. Her face was full of terror, and she was almost on the verge of breaking down. Mike gripped the steering wheel, breathing hard. He yanked the key from the ignition and restarted the engine. The car roared back to life, and they sped off, but as they passed the bunny man, Mike looked in the rearview mirror. The man didn't chase them. Instead, he stood still, watching them drive away, his expression chillingly blank. Laura kept her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, her breath shallow. The bunny man was still standing at the tunnel's entrance, holding his axe high. But as they neared the tunnel's end, Laura caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. The bunny man was lowering the axe, and as she blinked, he vanished into the darkness of the tunnel. They drove out of the tunnel and back onto the main road, but Laura still couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Who was he? What does he want? Mike's face was ashen, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but we're never going near that place again." The car sped on, but the air remained heavy, as if something wasn't right. As Mike turned to look at Laura, he froze. In the rearview mirror, there wasn't just the reflection of the road behind them. There, in the reflection, was the figure of the bunny man, his head bowed, standing right behind their car. The axe was in his hands, dripping something dark and red. "Mike, look behind us," Laura screamed, pointing at the rear window. Mike turned his head, but saw nothing. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. He slammed on the brakes again, and the car jolted to a stop. They sat there in stunned silence, neither one of them daring to move. After a long moment, Mike turned around and checked the rear-view mirror. Nothing. The bunny man was gone, leaving only the dark, empty road behind them. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away from that tunnel, but the air was still thick with fear. Every time they closed their eyes, they could hear that axe scraping through the air. It was as though the bunny man was always just behind them, waiting. To this day, Mike and Laura have never gone near that tunnel again, and every night, when the world goes quiet, they hear the sound of that axe dragging through the air. A chilling reminder that the bunny man is still out there, waiting for his next victim.